Hi there, everyone. I'm going to be doing a Facebook Live to take your questions for the next hour or so. As you may know, about a month ago, we started a Saturday morning AM call-in show, which has been a great opportunity to take questions from just regular folks across the province on chatting QR77 between 10 and 11 in the morning on Saturday. Like doing those, but because of that, I've been doing fewer Facebook Lives, but I figured this is probably a different audience. A lot of people online are not listening to radio and vice versa, so I thought it'd be good to get back into the swing of being available to you and in questions that matter to you. Just waiting for some of our first questions to pop up here. As you know, just put them in the comments section, and our team tries to select a good balanced cross-section of different issues that matter to you. Some good news, obviously, on the economic front. Alberta continues to lead the Canadian economy in growth and in job creation, 145,000 net new jobs created since the 1st of January last year, and record year last year for Alberta exports, for forestry, agriculture revenues, high tech, venture capital, film and television, and second best year ever for manufacturing, huge new investments in petrochemicals and hydrogen, and of course the oil and gas sector having a record year as well. All good news. I just got, and all of that's what's helped to lead to a balanced budget that we just passed about 3 weeks ago, the first one in 14 years. And I just heard that AIMCO, the Alberta Investment Management Corporation, has reported a 14.7% increase in return, I should say, on their investment portfolio last year. That's important because they basically invest all of the Heritage Fund and provincial government pension funds. So more good news on that front. So I'm going to go straight to questions. We've got one up here. Mr. Kenny, this is from Jason Rayome. Are there any updates from Keystone? I think Jason's referring to Keystone XL because Keystone proper was done and built by TC Energy about 7 years ago. But Keystone XL, as you know, was vetoed by President Biden about 15 months ago. And when he came into office the first day as an executive order. And now we, the government of Alberta, have launched a legal challenge for damages, basically suing the U.S. government for damages through a NAFTA process, as is TC Energy. They invested upwards of $8 billion. We invested a little over $1 billion into the project. We believe that the decision was prejudicial, that it was a retroactive reversal of a regulatory decision, and it therefore does not comply with the investor protection provisions of the North American Free Trade Agreement that have been carried over into the new Canada-US-Mexico agreement. So on top of that, I would just say to Jason that we continue to have fruitful discussions with many key leaders in the United States about what might be a replacement for Keystone XL. And I believe where there's a will, there's a way, that if we get the right alignment in the U.S. Congress, it's conceivable that you could have a strong majority, perhaps even a veto-proof majority, to pursue a successor to Keystone XL. And that's one of the issues I was discussing with the chairman of the U.S. Senate Energy Committee, Joe Manchin, here in Alberta last week. And we'll be down in Washington, I believe, in May to follow up those discussions, meet with the U.S. Senate Energy Committee to discuss what we call a North American energy strategy, which would include another major pipeline. Next question I'll go to is Jared Zazaluk. He says, why the digital ID? Thought you were against the Great Reset. Yeah, Jared, I don't know. I was asked this question on my radio show 2 weeks ago about this digital ID. I honestly don't know what you're referring to, what the digital ID is. Alberta government does not issue digital IDs. We issue things like driver's licenses and those paper health cards. We have committed in our platform to coming up with a more secure form of the health insurance card, because it's a flimsy little paper card. It's easily forged. But we're not going to get around that until the next term of government for a whole lot of technical IT issues I won't bore you with. But none of those are digital. They're not virtual IDs. They're actual physical, put them in your wallet kinds of ID. So I just don't know where that's coming from. It just sounds to me like another, I don't know, internet urban legend, perhaps. If you have more information or specifics about what you're asking about, please come back at us here on Facebook. post in the comment section below if anybody has information on what the Alberta Digital ID supposedly is. All right, Crystal Tate, when will Alberta drop the mask mandate for mass transit? Crystal, don't have a date on that. That would be in our final round of, we've basically lifted 99% of public health measures, and we did so months ago. But we did keep in some protocols around hospitals and nursing homes, as well as the mask mandate in mass transit. And the reason is this, there may be people who they don't have an alternative but to take the bus, and they may be immunocompromised. And people by nature are often sitting close to one another on a bus. So we thought it was a reasonable safeguard to keep in place for people who have no alternative but to use mass transit. As you know, right now we're in an increase in infections and a modest increase in hospitalizations because of the BA2 subvariant of Omicron. So I think we want to just see that situation stabilize and come down, and then hopefully we can move forward with lifting the remaining modest public health measures in the weeks to come. Teresa Piercy says, are there any plans to address the very high charges for home energy distribution and transmission fees on our electric and gas bills? Thank you, Teresa. That is an issue we've really dived into because, unfortunately, Albertans today have ended up inheriting and having to pay for, I would argue, an overbuilding of the transmission infrastructure for electricity, really for the past dozen years or so. And I'm talking like in the past decade, roughly, there's been about $14 billion of additional capital investment in electricity transmission infrastructure, the big power lines. And the way the system works is those costs get kind of amortized and passed on over time to the consumers, both residential, regular households, but also industrial business consumers. And the only way that we could abate those transmission costs, which are killing us all on our electricity bills, would be for us as the government to step in with your tax dollars to pay for a portion of those transmission costs. But that's just robbing Peter to pay Paul. It's just taking money out of your right pocket as a taxpayer to put it in your left pocket as an electricity consumer. And that doesn't get anybody further ahead at the end of the day. We've looked at this a lot of different ways, Teresa. We looked, for example, at whether we could extend the amortization period for the transmission infrastructure in the electrical grid. And the answer is no. There's no way we could do that. Technically, would not make the situation any better. So there's a couple of things we can do. One is we're providing this rebate, which is $150. We just introduced the legislation to push that through. And secondly, of course, we've paused the Alberta fuel tax, which adds to the cost of energy and everything. We've also paused we put in a $6.50 per gigajoule effective cap on natural gas prices for people paying for home heating and the like. So that will also bring down some of these energy costs. But the big thing is the carbon tax, because that's on top of the transmission costs. So we need to stop the Liberal NDP carbon tax, and it's planned where they plan to triple it between now and 2030. All right, Pam Dixon-Hersey says, question, it's been bugging me a long time. You are on the WEF website. Are you one of the infiltrated government politicians? Pam, I'm not on a World Economic Forum website. I'm quite sure of that. I mean, I don't know, maybe if I am, maybe they're quoting something I've said. I encourage you, invite you to do a sub post there with a link to that. I think that is not true, because I've never been to a World Economic Forum event. I've never had any interface with that organization whatsoever. The only time I've ever had anything direct is when the president and founder of that organization sent me a copy of his book, The Great Reset, last year, unsolicited and for free, and it went straight into my recycling bin. I have a hunch that they sent one to everybody in government leadership around the world. I have actually always been a public critic. I'm pretty sure you can go back to my social media accounts years and years ago, where I'm calling out the hypocrisy of the Davos set. Davos is the major so-called World Economic Forum meeting. And I've always just found it a bit risible, a bit ridiculous that these billionaires and Hollywood celebrities get together, political leaders, and in what to me has always looked like a huge act of virtue signaling, especially on issues like carbon taxes. People flying in on their private jets, telling the rest of the world to live in energy poverty. I've always found it slightly nauseating. No, I've not been involved in that organization. And now I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories swirling about that organization. So I would just encourage people, like I, for one, as a conservative, have always, frankly, disliked the World Economic Forum and the agenda and Klaus Schwab. And as I've said before, I particularly dislike the whole concept of the Great Reset, which is basically trying to exploit the crisis of COVID to bring in what I would call left liberal or socialist policies. So I disagree with those things in principle, but I will also say this: there's a lot of, I think, ridiculous conspiracy theories floating around out there that the World Economic Forum is controlling the world, and they invented COVID, and they've invented the vaccines to depopulate the world. Folks, it's one thing to disagree with a set of political ideas and to do that rationally, but I just encourage people not to get drawn into the rabbit hole of clearly ridiculous conspiracy theories. I don't think that helps make your case against certain policy ideas. Lily Miyagashima, I hope I got that right, Miyagashima says, appreciate you going to the States and fighting for Alberta's oil. Thank you, Lily. Yeah, I was down there meeting with the National Governors Association, met about a dozen governors in, I think it was February, and also senior leaders in Congress, as well as top U.S. union and business leaders. And I'll be going back in May, and we've really developed a particularly strong relationship with, as I mentioned, Senator Joe Manchin, who is certainly the most influential person on Capitol Hill. I mean, some U.S. media say he's the most powerful man in Washington because he is the key swing vote and effectively controls what happens in the United States Senate. So it's great that he spent not just a few hours here in Alberta, but 2.5 days really getting to learn our situation, our energy industry, and what a critical role that we play in North American energy security. We're really going to build on those relationships. All right, thank you. Teresa Courtney says, my question will not pass the moderators. It never does. Will there be an increase in the cost of living for AISH? Thanks, Teresa. Well, it did pass the moderators. The answer is that AISH in Alberta is far more generous than any of the comparable programs across the country. It's in fact 40% more generous than the average of income support for the disabled in other provinces. And it had not been indexed in the past. The NDP announced that as an election gimmick at the very end of their term after not having indexed it for 3-4 years. Because we were facing an $8 billion structural deficit, we had to find some savings, and one area where we did that was broadly on de-indexation of government programs, recognizing that our programs, including our tax exemptions and income support programs, are much more generous than other provinces. So we made that decision, but we paused indexation, as we said, as a temporary measure, and we'll come back and review all of those things. If in fact we see a sustained improvement in the province's finances. As you know, we did table a balanced budget, and things are looking good so far with high commodity prices, but we can't rush out and spend all of that. That's what we've made that mistake in the past in Alberta, and where it left us was like 14 of the last 15 years with deficits, and those deficits add up, accumulate in debt. We have to pay interest on it, and ultimately that forces up taxes. When taxes go up, investment goes down and jobs disappear. So that's the vicious cycle that the NDP got us into. We're now hopefully at the beginning of a virtuous cycle of growth and investment. And if that continues, then we may be able, in a measured and disciplined way, to address some cost pressures across government services, including AISH. Daniel Trainer asks, is there a plan to keep the removal of gas tax permanent? No, Dan, not permanent, but I I think we may very well maintain the current policy setting indefinitely, and that is it kind of just referring to the last answer I gave there, Dan, about the fiscal future of the province. Let's not get it in our minds that we're going to have $100 WTI, $100 oil, and $7 gas, and another economic boom. We have a boom, I think, but it's not going to go on forever. And so we've got to be mindful of our $90+ billion debt, and let's not drive ourselves back into the ditch of deficit spending. I say all of that, Dan, to say this, that the way we've arranged this gas tax relief is to say that there is a partial, I think it's a 50% reduction in the Alberta fuel tax if WTI is between $80 and $90, and if it reaches over $90 on a quarterly basis, then we go to zero on the 13-cent Alberta fuel tax. So what that does is to kind of protects our fiscal health, because if WTI comes back down significantly, down to, let's say, $75, $70, $65 or below, then provincial revenues on royalties come down, and then we come very close to getting back into deficit. So the way that we've kind of linked the fuel tax relief to the price of oil ensures that we can give you that relief while maintaining a surplus. That's the bottom line. Just to simplify it, the current structure means that we can give people that relief on the gas tax and maintain a surplus. But if oil prices collapse and our revenues do as well, then we're going to need the gas tax revenue to pay for things like healthcare and AISH and education and everything else. So that's why I wouldn't say we'll make it permanent. All right, 1 second. Thank you. Okay, so Christina Busoik, I think, says, you promise more autonomy. Where's the Alberta pension system? How about our own police and tax collection like Quebec? Good questions, Christina. So we continue to do a very complicated technical work on a potential Alberta pension plan. It would obviously be a hugely complex project to set up an Alberta public pension plan. So there's a lot of legal, actuarial, administrative, fiscal, and other issues that we're working through the Department of Treasury, Board and Finance. But I think it could bring huge benefits to the province by basically allowing us to capture and pass on to regular people the demographic advantage that we have maintained as a key part of our Alberta advantage now for decades. And so I support the idea in principle, and we'll present this concept to Albertans in greater detail over the course of the next year for them to consult more broadly with Albertans. On police, again, we've actually done a major paper on that, and it's now out for public consultations. I encourage you to share your views on that, because the RCMP union has been spending millions of dollars to fight the concept. They've gone to a lot of municipal governments, and I think presented an incomplete or inaccurate picture of this. I really believe in the value of community policing, that a kid growing up in Wetaskiwin should be able to go to the Alberta Police Academy and come back and serve their local community, let's say in Wetaskiwin, just like a Calgarian or an Edmontonian or a kid from Lethbridge or Red Deer are able to do in their own local municipal police services. I think rural Alberta could benefit from that. And again, we'll be completing these consultations and then making a decision. On the tax collection, I guess my point here, we asked the Fair Deal panel to advise us on that, and they said, basically be careful what you ask for. They recommended against it, because if we did that, it would require that we set up a parallel tax system to the feds. So right around this time of year, people are out there completing their in the spring and the winter, they complete their federal tax return. That incorporates the Alberta provincial income tax. And if we were to separate these two out, it would require a whole different set of books and receipts and tax forms. And the only people that would benefit from that would be the tax accountants and lawyers and bookkeepers. God bless them. So I really think the only way that a separate Alberta tax collection agency makes sense is if we were to also collect the federal income tax and then rebate them those revenues. Now, the federal Conservatives have promised, as a commitment to Quebec, that if they get into office, they will allow Revenue Quebec, to collect both the federal and provincial income tax on one form. And so if they do that, we would demand the same right, of course. So I think that's what we have to wait for, is a federal government that is willing to give us the flexibility to collect through a provincial revenue agency the federal tax, so we don't duplicate the kind of compliance burden that is already too heavy for many people. Donnie Coulter says, "You're in Trudeau's pocket." Well, thanks, Donnie. I'm pretty sure that Justin doesn't feel that way. And, you know, on issue after issue, I've been leading the fight for Albertans and for the provinces against the overreach of his government. We sued him on the carbon tax. We're suing him on the No More Pipelines Law, Bill C-69. Through allied First Nations, we're suing him on the tanker ban, Bill C-48. We pulled out of the federal parole board, created our own Alberta parole board. We've appointed our own Alberta chief firearms officer. We held our referendum on equalization as promised. We held our Senate elections. He doesn't like that, to put forward our own Democratic selected Senate nominees. We've been fighting his distortion of the allocation of seats in the House of Commons because it's unfair to Alberta. We got almost all provinces signed up in the fight against the Bill C-69, No More Pipelines Law. On issue after issue after issue, we've been fighting for this province. I don't know why you would think that makes me, quotes, in Trudeau's pocket. I mean, there are some issues where we have tried to find common ground, because you have to do that, right? It might be kind of emotionally or satisfying or politically convenient to do nothing but attack the federal government every single day on every single issue. But at the end of the day, what I think most Albertans actually want is results. And we've gotten results by getting into some heavy negotiating with them. For example, we got control over the regulation of major industrial greenhouse gas emissions, which has saved industry in Alberta billions of dollars. We got control over methane regulations. We got control over northern caribou habitat, because they were potentially going to sterilize a third of northern Alberta. We got $1 billion out of the feds for the well reclamation program that got thousands of good blue-collar oilfield service workers back on the job. We got $400 million out of them by lifting the cap on the fiscal stabilization program, something where I got all 13 provinces and territories to sign on. We have more progress to make there. And there's a lot more where we'll continue to try to work to find common ground. Canada Health Transfer would be another good example. We need the feds to pay their share of growing healthcare costs, so we're working with the other provinces on that. So I would say that we have a kind of a two-track approach. One is to find common ground, to get results wherever we can. But the other approach is, frankly, the one of confrontation, where we cannot find common ground, and we will never apologize for aggressively defending Alberta's vital economic interests. As Malik says, no jobs in Alberta, and I listen to you, it's full of jobs. Where is that Alberta full of jobs? Well, as when you say there's no jobs in Alberta, look, I acknowledge that unemployment is still too high. Pardon me, I believe 6.2%. And so there are still over 100,000 unemployed Albertans. But since January 1st of last year, according to Statistics Canada's Labour Force Survey, about 145,000 net new jobs have been created in Alberta, leading the country. Our unemployment rate has gone down to its lowest level since December of 2018. And our labor force participation rate, which is the overall percentage of the work, I should say that the overall percentage of the population that is of working age, that labor force participation rate has continued to grow slowly. It's still about, I think, 1.5% below our record high. So there's more work to be done, but the number one issue I hear from employers, right from restaurants to high-tech companies, from major construction firms to oil and gas, the number one issue I hear is that they're short of people. They're facing labor shortages and skill shortages. We addressed this just the other day. I had a news conference. You can check it out in the Facebook posting from Tuesday, where we detailed our $600 million Alberta at Work strategy to help people who are unemployed or underemployed get the skills they need to get into this growing economy, into the growing labor force. So I do feel frustration for people who are looking at a growing economy and growing job opportunities but are not finding one for themselves. And I just encourage you to reach out. There's a lot of support there for people to get connected to those jobs and to get additional support, training, skills upgrading, and the whole spectrum of support that you might need to get into the labor market. So I wish people who are still underemployed good luck in plugging in to what really is, well, it is the fastest growing economy in Canada. I was on my radio show a couple weeks back, I think it was 3 weeks ago, and a guy called up and said that he was an oil and gas worker but couldn't find any jobs. And after the show, I went on my phone, I just Googled oil and gas jobs in Alberta. And listings, pages and pages and pages of wanted ads popped up with jobs right across the skill spectrum, a lot of them like $40, $50 an hour jobs. And so I just not quite sure where that the kind of mismatch happens or how that happens, but there's no doubt that there's a lot of employers looking for people right now. Okay, Rand Silky says, what will you do to stop Trudeau's damaging policies, especially those designed to limit Alberta's opportunities in our oil and gas industry? So I've already addressed a lot of that earlier in response to an earlier question, Rand, including, I would say the most recent example of a damaging Trudeau policy attacking oil and gas would be the new so-called environment plan that they published 2 weeks ago, which is predicated on a significant reduction of oil production in Alberta. And that is none of their damn business, to be blunt with you. The clear language of the Constitution, Section 92A, says that the provincial legislatures have the exclusive authority to regulate the production of natural resources, including oil and gas. And that's the basis of our constitutional challenge of the federal, what we call the No More Pipelines Law, Bill C-69. And Rand, just keep an eye out for that. We should be getting a decision soon. It's been now 18 months waiting from the Alberta Appeal Court. But that should be an historic moment in our fight to defend our resources and our control over them. All right, so we'll go to, who's next here? I'm just waiting for another question to pop up, folks. So I guess I'll just carry on with Rand's question to say that, we challenged his carbon tax. Obviously, we lost that 5-3 at the Supreme Court of Canada. Part of our strategy is always to make alliances with other provinces. That's important. I mean, even Quebec has supported us on a number of these things, including Bill C-69. Okay, we fixed that technical problem. We got Jordan Kosick. You hired the WEF to do your review, genius. Yeah, Jordan, I don't know what review you're referring to. The WEF. No, I've never hired the World Economic Forum to do anything. I'm not aware of anything, at least as long as I've been Premier, that the government of Alberta has done to contract the World Economic Forum. So Jordan, I'm pretty sure you're just making that up, or maybe you've read it on one of the conspiracy websites. Maybe I'm confusing you with someone else, Jordan, but I did see somebody with posting the other day on Facebook that the global accounting firm Deloitte is controlled by is that the review? Oh, could you put that question back up? I think I know what Jordan's coming from now. If we could put that question back up. Yeah, I think I recognize your name, Jordan. I thought I saw you do a post the other day where you suggested that the international accounting firm Deloitte is affiliated with the World Economic Forum, and that I've contracted them to administer the United Conservative Party review vote. I think I understand now. So, Jordan, all I can do, really honestly, for you is recommend that you switch to decaf. Spend less time on the internet, go out for a walk, get some fresh air. There are no black helicopters. You don't like just the conspiracy theory mindset can be really corrosive, and then everything you see somehow starts to fit into the conspiracy theories, and that's exactly what you're positing here. But Jordan, I guess you're telling people that they shouldn't vote if they're members of the United Conservative Party in the leadership review because Deloitte, and one of the world's largest and most highly respected accounting and business consultant firms, has done something associated with the World Economic Forum, and therefore you're suggesting that if people send in their ballot, that somehow Klaus Schwab is going to steal their driver's license information. Like, honestly, that's just so ridiculous. I don't even know how to respond to it. The reality is, let me just explain the way the vote goes. First of all, I've not made any arrangements. It's not for the leader of the party, but rather the elected, accountable board of the United Conservative Party. And quite appropriately, they went out to a third-party vendor to help oversee the process. Very typically, the firms like Deloitte, other major accounting firms do this for shareholder votes and different kinds of votes. The Conservative Party of Canada uses either Deloitte or another major international accounting firm because it's a arm's length third-party administrator. And what happens is people will get the ballot in the mail. They have to make a photocopy of government-issued ID so that the voter can be validated. And then that goes in one envelope, and another envelope is their sealed ballot. All of those get mailed to Deloitte. They hold them, and then party volunteers come with scrutineers. They open the outside ballot or the envelope. They validate the ID, and that the person is a real member and a real Albertan with real residency. And then they drop the sealed ballot envelope into a secure box that gets taken, I think, by a Brinks truck to a counting location. There will be dozens of scrutineers, all of this overseen by both Deloitte as a major accounting firm and by the chief returning officer. So it's a secure process, and if you really believe that major international accounting firms are interested in your Alberta driver's license to pass that on to Klaus Schwab, as like I say, I can't help you. Just switch to decaf. All right, Don Orzek says, what are we at with nuclear power? Oh, that's a great question, Don. So, as you may know, we joined the task force between between Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and Ontario to look at small modular reactors and their feasibility in Canada. And the initial report of that group has come out. And they've identified a potential reactor technology for Ontario, but we're looking here for potential industrial application of much smaller, scalable reactors, particularly to help generate the steam for the steam-assisted gravity drainage in situ oil sands projects up north. One of the biggest challenges that our oil sands operators face is access to capital because of environmental social governance investment criteria. And because of the relatively high emissions profile of a barrel of bitumen compared to much of the other heavy crude around the world. And that has nothing to do with the viscosity, the thickness of the bitumen. It has to do with the energy required to extract it, particularly in those in situ projects, and the mines as well. And so if we could go to a zero emitting power source to generate those huge quantities of steam for the bitumen extraction, it would radically improve the emissions of the oil sands and guarantee a future for decades for that industry. So that's why the Oil Sands Pathways Group, to achieve their goal of net zero CO2 emissions by 2050, are very much looking at the possible application of small modular reactors. Just yesterday, I met in my office here in Edmonton with president of a company that's in the process of producing SMRs, small modular reactors, with cutting-edge technology. And he said to me he thought that Alberta was probably the greatest potential market for SMRs anywhere in the world right now. So very keen on that, and we've made it clear that we'll do whatever we can to facilitate potential investments in small modular reactors. We also believe we have some undeveloped uranium deposits in Alberta. As you know, way up in northern Saskatchewan, Uranium City, and elsewhere, they've had the second largest source of uranium. So as the world swings, I hope, back to greater nuclear power generation, there will be significant decades-long demand for uranium, and we could also potentially be a provider of that. All right, Marie Maud says, you're doing an excellent job, Premier Kenney. Continue. Thank you, Marie. I appreciate that. Let's get some more questions up there. We've done 15 questions, so sorry, I seem to be getting trouble loading these. All right, John Timms says, Premier, thank you for taking the time to answer our questions. A lot of effort and important work's been undertaken as a result of, as of recent, to get pipelines built. Do you have any further updates over the last few days and on Line 5 specifically? Yeah, so, well, Line 5 is the Enbridge line that goes from Ontario across the Straits of Mackinac to northern Michigan and then into Sarnia, provides much of the oil feedstock for the refineries in northern Ohio, for Detroit Airport, and then, of course, into the refineries in Sarnia that fuels much of the southern Ontario economy. And basically, almost all of the gasoline, for example, that's consumed between Sarnia and, say, Montreal, comes out of, ultimately comes off of Line 5. So it's a critically important part of the Canadian economy, 640,000 barrels a day of light sweet. So this is not dilbit. And as you know, the governor there has been trying to shut it down. So one of the reasons I went to Washington in February was to lobby the government there to get off the fence. My message was that the U.S. national government has a vital interest in the continuity of Line 5. Enbridge is trying to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to build a new high-tech subterranean replacement for the 60-year-old pipeline that would avoid any potential leakage into the waterway. And we're just trying to, Alberta has joined with Canada, Ontario, Saskatchewan in a legal challenge in the federal court and one in the state court in Michigan against the governor's order. So there's really no update on that, but I just thought I'd walk people through that. It's obviously something I discussed with Senator Manchin last week. You know, the commissioning of the Enbridge Line 3 in November of last year was a very important event, added about 380,000 barrels a day of egress for Alberta oil shipments. And that has really, it's one of the reasons we've seen the price differential come down. You may recall that we reached a catastrophic differential between WTI and WCS oil prices in the fall of 2018 that was as high as $45, $50. Well, it's been lately averaging about $12, $13. And the flex that we have in the system due to Line 3 has been a big part of that. And then finally, TMX seems to be more or less on schedule for completion in 2023. That's very good news. All right. Daniel Morlang says, you dodged the digital ID question 2 weeks ago. The Canadian Bankers Federation have a commercial on it. Most Albertans and Canadians do not want a China-style digital ID where the government can much more easily freeze your assets like they did. Where do you stand on this? Again, Daniel, I don't... the government of Alberta does not issue a digital ID. And there's no... I've never seen a proposal to begin doing so. I mean, there are some government forms of machine-readable ID. For example, for a better part of a decade, the passport has a chip built into it, so you can scan it on a machine and all the information pops up for the customs agent, the border agent, things like that. But it's not a virtual online identification. So I really honestly don't understand what is the digital ID to which you are referring. I mean, obviously, a lot of us have a lot of our personal information online. That is the reality of the internet. When you apply for an account, let's say an online bank account, or I don't know, a Netflix account, or open a social media account, you're giving some information, but you're consenting to the information that you give. And then the vendors, those companies, are limited. They have legal parameters in terms of respecting privacy, but also, and by the way, I'm not saying all the terms of and conditions of all of the online vendors are tight enough. I think there's constantly efforts to ensure plain English and stronger privacy protections. That's all good. But those companies, those online vendors that may have some of your some of your information online, they're also governed by both federal and provincial privacy legislation, which is quite strict. So I don't know if that's what you're referring to as the digital ID. So I'm really not clear on what that is about. Wade Hutchinson says, are you able to provide examples of critical race theory, socialist ideology, and collectivist philosophy from the 2018 K-6 curriculum rewrite? Absolutely, Wade, and I'd be happy to post the scope document that came out from the NDP government at that time on the K-6 draft social studies curriculum. Overwhelming focus on topics like, well, decolonization, which has been read by many critical race theory academics to basically mean exactly that. You know, what is critical race theory? Well, it is the application essentially of Marxist principles to questions of race and identity. And to boil it right down, the critical race theory posits that people are, whether they know it or not, either the perpetrators of institutional racism, white privilege, colonialism, or they are the victims of institutional racism, white privilege, white supremacy, and colonialism. And I think that's incredibly reductive. I think it is dehumanizing. I think it is deeply divisive. I think it is a crazy academic theory that does not belong in our elementary school classrooms. Canada's not a perfect society, but it's a pretty darn great society. And one of the reasons for our greatness is that our culture is a pluralistic one. We respect differences, and we're always striving to do better in that respect. As a country, we have faced up to many of our historical wrongs, including Indian residential schools and the Chinese head tax and racist immigration policies in the past. So I'm not suggesting that we, to coin a phrase, whitewash those realities of injustices in our past. We should teach those in a objective context that provides young people with basic civic and cultural literacy. That's what we're trying to do with the revised elementary social studies curriculum. We're taking a whole additional year to consult broadly because many of those are sensitive issues. But if you looked at the NDP draft curriculum, there was not one single reference there to basic facts, content required for minimal civic or cultural literacy. There was zero reference to confederation, to parliamentary democracy, to the rule of law, to these basic concepts or historical antecedents in our society. But there were dozens and dozens of references to historical injustices designed, I think, to paint a very, very bleak, negative, and critical picture of who we are and where we came from. So what we're trying to approximate here is a balanced curriculum that recognizes how we've built a society that in many ways is the envy of the world. You know, people of all racial and ethnic, religious backgrounds dream of coming to Canada, dream of coming to a place like Alberta. Not because we're some kind of dystopian racist hellhole, as some on the far left seem to believe, but because they see in us a society that believes in equality of opportunity and human dignity and equality of all before the law. So I think we should encourage a positive, yes, dare I say it, patriotism about how we built such a society, how we've defended freedom here and around the world. And really that was not evident at all in the highly politicized draft NDP K-6 social studies curriculum. Diane, and by the way, if you have questions about curriculum, I believe that at 6:30, so in half an hour, Minister LaGrange is going to be doing a province-wide telephone town hall for people who have questions, and maybe I could ask our team here to post information for folks who may be interested in the curriculum so that they could join Minister LaGrange as soon as I wrap up here in a bit. All right, registration is closed. Okay, Diane Lever says, what can you do about union groups who use union money to spread misinformation? Recent HSAA commercials among union members and are clearly partisan to NDP agenda. Yeah, thanks, Diane. Great question. So it's funny you should say that, HSAA. I remember in our very first period in government, like I don't even think we'd been in office for a month, if even a week, that particular union was already running ads attacking me personally in our government for, quotes, slashing healthcare. Just an outright, bald, total lie. Outrageous. I don't know how they get away with it, by the way, how advertisers are willing to take money to tell a lie like that. The health budget, just for the record, when we took office, it was about $19 billion. It's now about $21 billion. And that doesn't include the billions in COVID contingency funding that we added for the healthcare system. So the budget has gone up by about 10%. There's no way that you can misconstrue that as a cut. But that particular union has spent 3 years and millions of dollars coming from the forced union dues of their members to spread NDP propaganda and misinformation. So we kept a platform commitment to Albertans to pass legislation, and we did this about 18 months ago, and it allows union members to opt out of their dues going to finance non-core activities, by which we mean activities done by the union that do not relate to core collective bargaining or administrative functions. So basically, this kind of political advertising. Because, political contributions should be free will and voluntary. They shouldn't be coerced. When somebody signs up it goes to a workplace that happens to be unionized, they have the benefit of collective bargaining. We respect that. It's a constitutional right. No problem with it. But why should they be forced to finance political ads? There's a lot of union members. I suspect actually a plurality, if not a majority, of union members in Alberta has voted Conservative in the last election, and yet sometimes their dues are being forced to run ads that are NDP propaganda. I'll give you a good example of this. One of the big government unions, I think it's CUPE, runs. They run a program to support the Venezuelan socialist dictatorship. Well, certainly CUPW, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, has done that. I remember meeting a postal worker who had come to Canada as an immigrant or a refugee from Venezuela, socialism. And he said, why am I being forced to pay for socialist propaganda from the dictatorship that I fled? And I thought that's a very good question. So that's why we passed this legislation, and it came into effect, I believe, on April the 1st. I'm just looking for the specific reference here. I think it was in what we call Bill 2. I can't find the exact reference, but that legislation has now been passed, and that is a right that union members now have. All right. Denise says, what are your thoughts on cryptocurrencies? That's not a very specific question. Let me think. I think that cryptocurrencies are an interesting new form of currency. I think they have certain advantages, potentially, which is that they are generally outside of the control of government, and but there's also potential risks. And I guess my advice would be, before people decide to put much of their money in cryptocurrencies, they do their own research and be well informed so they know what the risks are. So Michelle Milne says, when are you going to increase the basic personal amount on Alberta income tax? Albertans are paying more provincial tax due to this bracket creep. Thank you, Michelle. So, we'll keep an open mind on that. Michelle, as I mentioned before, when we came to office, we inherited from the NDP an $8 billion structural deficit. And there was just absolutely no way that we could get our finances in order unless we found some savings. And so we temporarily paused indexation, recognizing that, please understand, the Alberta basic exemption, I think it's now $18,600, is by far and away the most generous in Canada. It is about $4,000 more generous than the next most generous province, which is Saskatchewan. And like most provinces, only have a basic personal exemption in the $12,000, $13,000 range. So we're way more generous. And about 40% of Albertans pay no income tax at all, largely because of the generosity of the basic personal exemption. So we thought that was a relatively modest measure, amongst others, to get our finances back under control so we could get to a balanced budget. But we did say it was a temporary measure, so we'll consider whether and when to bring back indexation. We will be appointing a panel to advise us on how to get the most efficient tax system for Alberta for economic growth and job creation. And they may be giving us advice on that, so just stay tuned on that. All right, Linda Green Dupre says, I'm wondering, is there anything you can do to get vax passports lifted from flying? I realize it's Trudeau's call, but wondering if you can push it somehow. Thanks, Linda. Yeah, we have pushed that, and I agree with you. We did bring in a motion in Alberta's legislature that the government voted for, the government MLAs, calling on the Trudeau federal Liberal government to drop the remaining travel restrictions, and particularly the vaccine passport. We think it serves no useful public health purpose. They don't have an alternative, which is a negative test, which might be a reasonable accommodation. But in any event, I think it's a pointless policy. And I do not know of any other major country in the world that has a similar policy. So I totally agree with you, Linda. Okay, we'll take maybe just a couple more questions because we've been at this for over an hour. Marge Smith says, if you're successful in your leadership review, what will you do to unite the UCP before the next election? I don't appreciate the infighting. Well, neither do I, Marge. Thank you very much. And I am confident that the grassroots members of the United Conservative Party will endorse my leadership in this review vote. I am happy to be held accountable, and I will accept whatever their judgment is without reservation. As I said at our virtual SGM, Special General Meeting, a couple of weeks ago, if the members decide that they want a leadership election, I will respect that with gratitude for having had, I think, the best job in Canada as Premier of Alberta. But if they decide to maintain unity, continuity, stability, for us to go forward together into a new era of prosperity, then I will take that as marching orders for our entire team, including our caucus, to get our act together, to focus our opposition not on each other, but on the NDP and on the Trudeau Liberals, and to bring in a renewed sense of teamwork and discipline. You know what Albertans expect from their government isn't a constant soap opera, and a kind of, they certainly don't want to see a family feud. And we as Conservatives know that we cannot win if we are divided. Conservatives know that we must be united, and unity requires a degree of discipline. I learned that working in Stephen Harper's government, who very effectively reunited the Conservative movement nationally and kept it together. Sometimes he was criticized for being too strong in maintaining that discipline, but in retrospect, I think it was necessary to maintain the unity and coherence of our government, party, and movement. And if I've made a mistake in the past 3 years, perhaps it's I've been far too tolerant of public expressions of opposition coming from within, because I respect the role that MLAs play. And I think there are totally legitimate times when MLAs should be able to speak out for their constituents or share somewhat different views on policy. But if that becomes nothing but a constant effort at an internal civil war, well, I don't think that's acceptable. And I'm looking forward to the decision of our members. If they decide to endorse unity and continuity, again, I will convey that to our colleagues as our marching orders for us to be focused, united, and disciplined. All right, Selena Ling Simmons says, can you talk about choice in education or everyone pay for children to attend private schools? My tax dollars should not go to schools that would never accept my son with disabilities. Okay, thank you, Selena. So I think school choice or choice in education is, I think, a great Alberta tradition and value. It reflects pluralism. You know, all parents pay into the tax base that funds the schools. And if parents decide that their kids will benefit from a particular kind of education, a charter school, a publicly funded alternative school, homeschooling, independent schools, we think that at least a significant portion of their tax dollars should follow that kid and support that kid's education. And that's one of the reasons we developed such a strong education system. It's true there have been some declines in outcomes in areas like math and reading proficiency in recent years, but generally speaking, for much of the past 30-some years, Alberta's been a world leader in our education system, and I think that's in part because of the innovation and excellence that comes out of competition. Because of school choice here in Edmonton, back in the 90s, when the Klein government expanded support for independent schools and created the charter schools, well, the Edmonton Public and Catholic boards saw this as they saw this as a kind of catalyst for them to offer their own specialized programming. So we have a lot of really good alternative specialized programs in the K-12 public and separate systems here in Edmonton. That's a great example of how a rising tide lifts all boats. So, and independent schools do accept special needs kids. You know, I saw a column, an op-ed by former NDP leader Ray Martin in, I think, the Journal recently, and he was really viciously attacking the charter schools, saying that they're basically just another word for private schools. Well, I just visited a charter school here in Edmonton whose particular focus is on having a strong, disciplined learning environment. And I was astonished to see the vast majority of kids were coming from new Canadian families, many from refugee backgrounds. I knew because I was talking to the kids, many from East African refugee families, many of whom live in far southeast Edmonton, but their kids were taking a 45-minute bus to go to the school because it offered more discipline and better learning outcomes. So these are kids coming from, in many cases, very challenged low-income families with multiple barriers benefiting from school choice. They're not allowed to turn anybody away, for example, in those public charter schools. So I think, Selena, I would just say, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Embrace pluralism. Embrace choice. Embrace competition. It's worked well for Alberta education. Okay, I think I'll just take maybe 2 more questions. Darcy Lee says, hey, Jason, although I may not agree with all of your decisions, I still support your bigger picture and vision for Alberta. How's our hydrogen program development coming? First of all, Darcy, on your opening, I remember Stephen Harper used to say to us that he'd go to a hockey game and people would be coming up saying, hey, Prime Minister, I don't agree with everything you do, but generally I think you're on the right track. And he would say, that's funny because I don't agree with everything I do either. You know, Darcy, in government, often you only have bad choices. And that was particularly the case in COVID. So I totally hear what you're saying. Hydrogen is really moving along well. We've had, I think, 5 announcements about major prospective hydrogen projects in the province, and I can tell you there are many more on the horizon. We're attracting these thanks in part to our natural gas vision and strategy, and the recent federal tax credit for carbon capture, utilization, and storage that we focused on is going to help, because for these projects to be financed in the ESG investment climate, they need to demonstrate that they are low or net zero emissions projects. And partly that requires access to carbon sequestration infrastructure and subterranean pore space. We just announced the winners of a competition for the allocation of pore space in the Edmonton region. We're now going forward in the rest of the province to do that, so that's another major step forward. As I say, the investment tax credit from the feds is another major step forward. Our Alberta Petrochemical Incentive Program and our inclusion of hydrogen projects within that, another big win. The flexibility we've given to municipalities to offer local property tax breaks for big capital projects like this, the pre-approved regulatory zones like the industrial heartland. So all of that stuff is kind of working together. Plus, according to the Boston Consulting Group, Alberta has the second best geological formations in the world for carbon sequestration. So I think you're going to see a huge hydrogen industry here taking off. In fact, I think next week or two, the CEO of a major international firm involved in hydrogen will be coming here to meet with me in Edmonton, and I hope come to a final investment decision on their project. All right. Peter Darlington asks, is there a plan to acknowledge the global shift away from fossil fuels? Well, Peter, I would say the plan is to deal with reality. And the reality is this, that the world is consuming about 100 million barrels a day of oil right now, which, if you take out the obvious dip during COVID, has been pretty consistent now for the better part of a decade. And the International Energy Agency projects that this decade, in the next 20 years, that may go up. It may also go down. In their fully Paris climate conference, let me rephrase that. In their scenario, which assumes full compliance with the Paris Climate Treaty, they would see us coming down to about 70 million barrels a day by 2040. So yes, in that scenario, there is a meaningful, about a 30% decline in demand, but there would be a proportionate offset increase in demand for natural gas as much of the world gas moves to gas cogen for power production away from thermal coal. So there will continue to be demand for decades to come for oil. It will diminish eventually, for sure, but it will still be important. And so the plan, Peter, is this, that the last barrel of oil extracted and sold in global markets in a kind of notional way should, in our view, come from Alberta, not from Saudi Arabia, not from Venezuela, not from Russia. It should come, and for us to be that last barrel, that is to say, for us to have a decades-long future for the commodity, we need to get our emissions down. And Alberta's been investing in that for the better part of 15 years. The huge forthcoming expansion of carbon capture, utilization, and storage will help the oil sands get to about 50% of the way to their net zero goal by 2050. So through the application of technology, we can make significant improvements in our emissions profile. And then look at everything else. Our stable liberal democracy, our transparent publicly traded companies that are the producers, the human rights and labor rights and everything in Canada, we knock the socks off of any of our competitors around the world. That's why I say our goal, our strategy must be and can be to be the last barrel that is produced. Teresa Courtney says, Kenny's fought an uphill battle since day one. I applaud him for his efforts. Thank you. Well, thank you, Teresa. That's not a question. You know what? I'll close it out on a positive note. We've taken 28 questions in about the last hour and a bit. So I always enjoy these things, folks. I always joke that the questions are a lot better than I get in question period, but that actually is no joke. And if you're free on Saturday morning, tune into my radio show on CHED in Northern Alberta and QR77 in Southern and Central Alberta between 10 and 11 a.m. We take questions for an hour, and it's another great opportunity to stay in touch and to be held accountable. So thanks very much, everybody, and look forward to chatting again soon.